Welcome to everyone in our Mindfulness Monthly community. My name is Kelly Boyes, and I'll be your host for this evening. If you have questions for our featured teacher, you can submit your questions in the box below the video player on the event page. Tonight, we are talking with Thubten Jinpa. Thubten Jinpa has been our featured teacher for the month of June. He has offered our community teaching and practices all centered around the theme, conscious intention leads to awareness and compassion. He trained as a monk at the Shartsa College of Gandhin Monastic University in South India and holds a BA in philosophy and a PhD in religious studies, both from Cambridge University. He has been the principal English translator to His Holiness the Dalai Lama since 1985 and has translated and edited many of his books, including the New York Times bestsellers Ethics for the New Millennium and The Art of Happiness. His own publications include translations of major Tibetan works featured in the Library of Tibetan Classics series, and his latest book, A Fearless Heart, How the Courage to be Compassionate Can Transform Our Lives. He's the main author of the Compassion Cultivation Training, an 8-week formal program developed at Stanford University. Jinpa is the president of the Compassion Institute and has been a core member of the Mind and Life Institute from its inception. Jinpa lives in Montreal and is married with 2 daughters. Welcome to Thubten Jinpa. We're so glad to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you, Kelly. It's a real honor and pleasure to join you.
Jinpa, I'd love to begin by asking you to share with our audience a little bit about your journey and what led you here to this moment, being on this call, sharing about compassion and awareness with us.
Well, it's quite a long story. Some of you may know, I grew up as a Tibetan refugee child in India. My parents were part of the first generation of Tibetan refugees who left in the early 60s. And so I was brought up in a traditional Buddhist culture and society, although a refugee community. And then later on, I chose to join a monastery instead of going to a formal conventional school. So, mindfulness and meditation, and those were sort of kind of part of the everyday, something that we just take for granted. But what led to me being here today, perhaps one of the most direct causes of that has been having this accidental honor of becoming the Dalai Lama's principal interpreter in 1985. I was a monk then in South India. And once I became his principal interpreter, and when it became obvious that he was expecting me to continue to serve him for a long time, it was a long-term commitment, then I went to Cambridge to sort of improve myself, to make myself more efficient in serving him. And that led to a much more interaction and integration in my own life of East and West. And then when I stopped becoming a monk, then I had to make myself employable. So I went back to Cambridge to do a PhD so that at least I could, have something that I could use to look for jobs. And then in the process, I met my wife, future wife, who's now, my wife, Sophie. She's from Montreal. And we moved to Montreal when we, about almost 20 years ago, when we had our first child, so that at least we will have one set of grandparents on for the children, because my parents are both, deceased. Perhaps the immediate cause is really my having the opportunity to develop an 8-week secular compassion training at Stanford, which then led me to write a book for general audience. And one of the things that I've been trying to do sort of, in a gentle way, in my own quiet way, is to really, bring awareness to this growing community of mindfulness enthusiasts that, there is something else, that they need to now build on the foundation that they have, which really has to do with intention, compassion, and combining that with mindfulness. So this is what has led me to saying yes to your Mindfulness Monthly invitation.
Well, that actually leads me right to the framework for our discussion this evening. We practiced with you this month, getting to know our deeper aspirations and also the core guiding values or principles for our lives. And I love the frame that you have around that. And so often, especially in the mindfulness community, the focus is on being present on what's arising in any given moment, and the focus is on the awareness. And the practices that you teach, they're different and they're refreshing for our group, and they're also very proactive, and they have an ethical component. So I'm just curious if you could frame a little bit for us the place for this within the context of mindfulness meditation, and why this has been a passion for you to bring as kind of a next step for people who develop those foundational qualities of mindfulness first.
Yes, I think one of the important things about mindfulness, I mean, there are a couple of things. One is really some ability to quieten your mind and find a more settled kind of energy. And it doesn't come naturally. Now, some people probably have natural affiliation to that, but most people, I mean, there was a very influential paper that came out that said that the default position of human mind is the wandering mind, and then a wandering mind is a suffering mind. So there was a very powerful paper which really demonstrated that even when we are supposed to be working or paying attention, almost 50% of the time we are distracted. So, and then generally for most of us, unless you're trained, we're able to retain our attention either by a perception of a threat, which brings, forces us to pay attention, danger, or novelty, some new information within our kind of perception field. Those are the two things that generally anchor ordinary people's attention. What mindfulness teaches us is the ability to actually consciously pay attention so that you can be there even when doing a boring, tedious task, so that your attention, your ability to sustain your attention doesn't require some kind of novelty, new information to keep you kind of interested. That's an important skill, and it's a skill that needs to be cultivated. The other one is the ability to be with our experience without rushing to judgment. Again, that is also not normal. It doesn't come naturally because we are emotional, feeling creatures, and our antennae are very sharp in picking up painful experiences and dangers and threats, and we react to situations that we don't like, which are aversive. And generally what we do is we suppress that, we avoid it, and we even don't want to think about it. So that's generally how we react. And that's how, even animals do. But the problem with that is often suppression and aversion actually only pushes the problem further. And at some point it pops up. So it never really goes away. So what mindfulness teaches us is the ability to just be with the experience without rushing to judgment, so that you don't have to react to an aversive situation with aversion. And that is a powerful skill. That really is a powerful skill, and it takes time. And the third thing that mindfulness skills teach you is the meta-awareness, the ability to step back and take a kind of observer standpoint and really look at your mind as a kind of a theater of experience in which things are unfolding. So these three things are very, very important skills. And I'm not surprised that mindfulness is turning out to be very efficient in dealing with all sorts of problems. Now, once we have certain degrees of these skills, then it's actually in our interest to add in a bit more proactive components, like connecting with our intention, because we are all, none of us come into the world as a clean slate. Even right from the beginning, even in womb, we are conditioned by our interaction with the mother's voice, whatever mother eats and so on. When you come out, all of this conditioning is there. So we as we grow up, we inherit assumptions, attitudes, biases, as well as values. Okay. And often we don't pay attention. They only come up when we are confronted with a challenge. And if something is an important value for us, when that is threatened, we feel out of sync. That's an indication that this matters to me. So by paying conscious attention to your intention, your aspirations, and your values, the chances are that you are going to be more aware of what are those things that are important for you, what drives you, what inspires you. And then that way you can really kind of make them more proactive forces in your life. So compassion training really has the ability to tap into this, connecting with our deeper aspiration, checking in, connecting with our conscious intention, so that sets the tone in our everyday, and then acting it out and also, sort of enhancing our empathetic, impulses. Again, empathy is a natural quality, and it's also a relational emotion. So by taking care of our empathy, we also, take care of the quality of our relationship with people important in our life. So I think those things are, even from a purely secular, everyday kind of well-being point of view, these are very important and helpful skills that we can learn. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love the connection that you make between the intention setting and then being in touch with a deeper aspiration. It feels like a really important piece. And as you say, usually we get in touch with our values and our deeper aspiration when things go off or wrong.
Yes.
And this place of you talk about doing a daily practice to get in touch with both those practical daily intention setting pieces and then the deeper aspiration. And you say that to ask the question and then you said in your teaching to stay with the energy of the question. And I found that very important, that it wasn't a heady intellectual kind of an inquiry.
Sure.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about this link between the setting the intention and then the heartfelt deeper aspiration and how that inquiry works in meditation.
I think the deeper aspirations are, often remain kind of unarticulated for most people. And also deeper aspirations are also what forms what in NVC language, they call it core beliefs. Mm-hmm. And the core beliefs are what actually motivates us to act in a particular way. So the deeper aspirations, this is where I think something like mindfulness meditation helps, because we're able to become more aware. So by consciously asking the question, constantly asking question, what is it that I aspire for my loved ones? What is it that I wish, So, and then in the West, generally, when you ask a question, you expect an answer. That's a kind of a typical Western approach. That's why I often emphasize, just stay with the energy. And if there's nothing pops up, don't worry, but just be with the open question. And at some point, if you keep asking, things will pop up. Okay. And this is where I think it's important, because, and sometimes part of that discovery may in fact be triggered by a memory of a joy that you experienced when you did something. So that shows that it really mattered to you. And that joy is not just as pure, just an immediate sensory gratification type, but it has a more enduring kind of, deeper sense of fulfillment, sort of giving a sense of purpose. And when you feel a sense of purpose, there is a tremendous sense of fulfillment, which makes us almost kind of, expanded in our being, So those kind of things, if you pay a bit more attention, keep asking the question, keep the questions open, at some point, gradually these things will pop up. So, and then the idea is, once you begin to discover what are your deeper aspirations, what are the things that really truly inspire you, that elevate you, that motivate you, then you have a chance to make them more conscious in your everyday life. So in some sense, this is similar to the idea that some education theorists, they try to motivate students and say, find that spark, find that spark. So it's a kind of a similar idea. The Buddhists, of course, wouldn't use that language, but it's, finding that spark idea is very similar to this kind of keep reflecting. And the conscious intention is really kind of something that you do by saying, if, for example, and this is where you can be a bit more instrumental and pragmatic. So if you are, for example, if people are working this mindfulness monthly, this particular month on awareness and intention and compassion and their connection, so then you can set the intention during this month, every day, to pay more attention, to become consciously more aware. And also to see as much as possible if you can bring compassion as part of your equation in thinking about everything, whether it is your relationship with your spouse, your children, the way you treat your colleagues at work, the way you think about the world situation, the way you think about the world's problem. See if you can bring compassion as part of an important equation. And this is what I mean by daily conscious, intention setting. You choose, and you can't, say if you set the intention that I want to save the world today, that's impractical, So when you set intentions, you would want something that is a bit more specific, that you can at least see what it looks like when you do it.
I continue to be surprised by the power of this and how simple it is, yet not easy to remember, and yet how powerful it is. And I know this, and I know many of us know this, and yet bringing more awareness to this dynamic that we can cultivate feels so important for us right now, and where we find ourselves in the world. And so I appreciate you magnifying it. And
thank you.
I had another question about values, because you talk about get in touch with the values that motivate you. And I'm curious, as you've taught over the years and as you've interacted with people, do you see that there are some core values that are universal that people tend to track back to?
Yeah, I would say yes, because, almost everybody are inspired and elevated when they see a good Samaritan behavior. I mean, it's basically, that's universal. Some people may choose not to respond in this way, but then that's a choice they are making. You can choose to switch off. You can choose to exclude a certain group of people from your circle of concern. Those are choices people can make. But as human beings, at a very fundamental level, I think all of us are inspired and feel elevated when we see a truly good act done. Just a spontaneous helping behavior. And because we are ourselves relational creatures whose experience of happiness and suffering is defined primarily by the quality of our relationship with others. All of us at a very fundamental level really yearn to be recognized, to be loved, to have the ability to matter in someone's life. That's human nature. This is what, we constantly seek connection. And there's a reason. It's not a coincidence that, loneliness is one of the most painful experiences, because that prevents us from being human. Human beings are relational beings. So because of that, there are fundamental things that really all of us value. Now, whether a particular culture elevates that as an important cultural and societal value, that is something else. But individually, the fact that, we all love our children, and all of us, when we see a young child suffer or a young child, thrive in a particular, stage, we all feel either, painful or elevated. That shows the power of that kind of, value. So, I know that some philosophers would argue that there's no such thing as universal values, but then they are talking about societal values.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And one other thing that you emphasized in your teaching this month with us was an emphasis on the beginning and the end. And you said, it's important at the beginning to emphasize the compassionate intention that you're setting. And then it's also important at the end to emphasize this kind of quality of joy and having a sense of dedication to your practice or to what just happened. It's like bookends to noticing what's actually going on. And it seems to me this brings us out of kind of a sleepwalking state and into understanding what we're actually doing. Could you talk a little bit about that importance of the beginnings and the ends?
Well, I think the good thing about the beginning is that because especially in the morning where most of us are kind of fresh. I know some people who, just are not very sharp in the morning, but most people are quite sharp in the morning, especially after you have splashed some cold water on your face and woken up. So it's a very good time to, sort of bring some kind of freshness into your day. And also generally mornings tend to be quiet and, our senses have not been fully bombarded by a whole lot of visual and sensory information. So it's a good quiet time. And the intention setting practice, the beauty of it is it doesn't take very long. You can even do it in a minute or two. So that's the beauty of it. What it does require is to bring your full presence when you do it, to really kind of, sort of first calm yourself a little bit, maybe half a minute. And once you have calmed yourself, then you make, if you have long time, then you can connect with your deeper aspirations. But on a daily basis, that's a tough one. You can simply sort of, consciously set some intentions for the day. And then to have a kind of a imagery of choosing a bass tone for a music, which is like setting the tone for the day. And if you do that, then the chances are in your day-to-day interaction, you are able to bring more awareness because of that conscious intention. Because in the end, awareness is not something that we can fake. Awareness is like emotions. It either is there or it's not there. You cannot fake it. Thoughts you can simulate it. But awareness is always a byproduct. And it comes, whether or not awareness is, you can bring awareness, is to a large extent function of mindfulness and intention. So this is why mindfulness practice is important, because in a formal sitting, the more mindfulness you do, the chances of having greater awareness in your everyday life. And then intention is what connects that. So doing that in the morning really kind of sets a good tone in the morning. That's a good way of thinking about it. And then at the end of the day, I think it's always a good idea to round it up so that it's not just an open-ended kind of, like sort of, when you're working on a book, you generally, until you finish the whole manuscript, you tend to write only in chapters and chapters and save the file separately so that you can manage. So with the brain needs some structure to manage. So doing a dedication at the end of the day, it's like managing that 24-hour or whatever it is. And then as much as possible, remembering to choose some of the joyful moments is a really good one, because one important insight from Buddhist psychology is that, you can always exert your will to motivate something, or fear can motivate something. But to sustain motivation, you need to have a joy. If there is no joy, you cannot sustain motivation for a long time. That's why if you look at many questions of burnout, often at the root of the problem of burnout is a work environment where there is no place for joy, where the employee has to consciously use the power of will to survive in that work environment. The employee is not getting any sense of fulfillment or any recognition, or there's no element of joy. So it's very difficult to sustain motivation. So in your own everyday life, spiritual practice, I think remembering to find those moments of joy and recognizing them and remembering them is very important, because otherwise at some point, you give up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And this actually leads me right into some of the audience questions around work. Actually, there are a couple of those, and then other questions that we have that have come in for you. So I'll get into the first one. Ben wants to know, he says, I have a daily intention to work in a more peaceful way and in a more peaceful environment at my job. This feels somewhat out of my control. So how do I set this intention up in the morning so I don't feel like I fail at the end of the day?
Well, actually, setting your intention to find a more peaceful way of working is a really good one. But at the same time, you should also watch your expectations so that you don't expect other people to be, adjusting around your intention so that, you can fulfill your, intention. So one thing that you can do is, because generally at a working place, if you set the tone and if you demonstrate on a consistent basis a particular style of working, for example, like if you're doing a particular thing, you want to be left alone. There are moments in your day, everyday work where you deliberately choose a quiet moment. So those kind of things, you need to choose a kind of a ritual. The ritual is not the right word, but you know what I mean. I mean, there's kind of a structure, and then people then immediately adjust, over time to the style that you bring, and then you will find a more peaceful way of working. So, I mean, having more peace in a work environment, we should not equate peace with just quietness. Okay, because in the end, peace is a state of mind. And that state of mind can coexist in a noisy environment as well. So you just, but it takes a little while. It takes, a little while.
Yeah, and actually the next question is a little similar around someone feeling, Ryan says, I have a deeper aspiration and intention, but it feels out of my control and in the hands of my supervisor at work. And how do I handle this? So it's interesting having someone feel and be in connection with their own deeper aspirations and intentions, but feeling that someone else is holding control.
Sure. I mean, in a workplace, generally that is the case, because when you're working in a kind of a larger setting, a group setting, there is also issues of power dynamics, responsibility levels, and so on, who's reporting to who. So those are very practical aspects of working in a group setting. But one thing that is helpful is once in a while, I think, to be able to share consciously or explicitly your wish, your aspiration to your superiors is always helpful. Because sometimes your superiors tend to do things without knowing what your particular aspiration is and where you are able to bring your own strength. And they may be sometimes doing this completely out of good intention, trying to help you. But you are yourself the best person to show the supervisor, if they want to really help me, this is the best way to do it. So this kind of dialogue is important. And then the other thing is also to, as much as possible, try to keep empathy for your superiors as well, because in some ways, the more power you have, the more stress you have, because in the end, the buck stops at a higher level. So those kind of things, remembering that, sometimes will reduce your tendency to be frustrated when things don't go your way. So I think, setting intention, but do not have expectation is the important bit, because intention is really kind of about you. Expectation is about others. So it's a sort of this is where sometimes the Buddhist advices get very challenging. For example, like, one of the fundamental advices in Buddhism is to be passionate about the pursuit, what you're doing, your goal, your pursuit, your motivation, your action, but don't get attached to a fixed idea of an outcome. Now, generally, if you're committed to doing something, you also attach to the, outcome and the result. But over time, you get the hang of it. And so I think those kind of things are important. So intention setting is really about you, sort of priming your mind and emotion to feel in a particular way, to be more resilient, to be more aware, to be more empathetic. But don't bring that expectation into the equation, because then that becomes a source of frustration.
Mm-hmm. And I like that you emphasize the presence to whatever the intention is, that I don't have to withdraw presence from that. Even if I am open to whatever outcome comes, I can still be fully present and engaged.
Exactly.
And that unfolding.
Sure.
Yeah. And we have another question from Heather. This is in the interpersonal realm. And she'd like to know what you'd say about how do you speak with kindness and compassion? And I don't know if this is at work or at home, but when you strongly disagree with someone, how do you speak with kindness and compassion is Heather's question.
I think when you strongly disagree with someone, I think, an important thing that is demanded by responding to that out of kindness and compassion is to maintain your composure. Because if you lose yourself, if you lose your composure, then the chances of saying something compassionate and empathetic is pretty much low, if not zero. And generally, when we get angry, we also are responding in a defensive manner. And as human beings, when we react in a defensive manner, we feel threatened. That's very natural. And all the stress hormones kicks in. The voices are raised, and so that's. So if Heather is serious about finding a way to respond to opinions that you really strongly disagree. And these days in America, that's not difficult to find. So I think it's important to first find a way to get to that more composed state of mind so that you can really respond and speak from that place of calmness. And secondly, to really try to understand where that other person's view is coming from. Sometimes, not always the case, but in the case of, say, for example, diametrically opposed political opinion on a given issue, sometimes if you dig deeper, both sides are really coming from a same place, whether they think that's the best way to structure society or whether they think that's the most fairest system, whatever it is, if you dig deeper and deeper, you will be able to get to a place where there is a commonality, at least in the aspiration, in the aims. And then how to go about making that real is where the differences come into being. And some of these differences will be really real. For example, like the whole debate about, right now, the big debate in America is about the power of the public unions. That seems very scary if that power is gone. And then this whole business of individual choice versus societal responsibility to the poor. Those are, very, very opposed political opinions, disagreements. But I think it's important, especially if you are engaging with someone face to face, try to, make the other person see where you're coming from. And if you force yourself to see where that other person is coming from, so that at least you can get a commonality. Because if you don't find any commonality, then it's basically, my way or highway kind of, So there's not much meeting ground. But in most disagreements of opinion or views, you do end up coming to because you may still disagree, but at least you will both respect each other, saying that, okay, that's how this person sees the world, but that's not how I see the world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So it's all very timely for what we're facing. And there's one more question around the theme of the month, and then we have a few other questions generally around meditation. So the next question is from Helen, and she'd like to know, when setting intentions, for example, peace, joy, compassion, where do you see the balance between setting the intentions to shape the thoughts and actions, along with checking in how it went, and then opening into a quality of presence with peace, joy, and compassion naturally flowing?
Yeah. So I think you will find the balance. But initially, the intention is what sets the tone in the morning. It's like priming. So it's like just slightly tilting the direction of your thoughts and emotion. And then, the natural thoughts and emotions are going to unfold, because we are not going to be living consciously the whole time. But the more you prime and point your thoughts in a particular direction, the chances are that you're more likely to, have more of those. So I think that's important. So it's not that everything needs to be consciously cultivated, but you do need to show some direction. And the intention setting is really trying to, turn that steering a little bit. But what comes after is often, natural. And also, for example, like even the qualities like compassion, it's not that through meditation we are learning how to be compassionate. We do have the seed for compassion in all of us. But what we are trying to do is to make that more proactive part of our everyday life, because generally we tend to leave compassion at the mercy of situation. If it is triggered by a sight, we feel compassionate. And then for our loved ones, we bring it out. But otherwise, we just leave it at the mercy of a situation. And for strangers, the compassion is elicited only when the stranger is really acutely in pain or real obvious suffering. But most of the time, we don't really care. So the practice really is to enhance that capacity and also make it more active part, so that it becomes more of a standpoint from which you relate to the world, rather than a response that kicks in when triggered by a situation. So those are ways in which you can, and it's not something that you're faking, because the quality is already there. What you're doing is you are kind of opening it up and making it play a more important role, because we have fear, we have anger, and in our everyday action, many of our behavior are often triggered and motivated by those other impulses. And judgment and fear, we respond to situations out of feeling of threat or defensiveness. Or we can choose to respond to that same situation from a place of compassion, understanding, and empathy. And that changes everything. And particularly in an important relationship, if you are able to bring more of that, qualitatively, everything changes.
I like the phrase, the standpoint of compassion, the place from which life is viewed.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's a beautiful framework for it. And I can turn into a couple of the other questions about meditation. People knew that you were going to be live and they're asking their questions for you. So Mike wants to know, he's, I believe, in Victoria. As much as I try and have tried for almost 2 years to quiet my mind when meditating, I still can't conquer my wandering mind, even if I work on making it my intention prior to meditating. I've tried everything other teachers have suggested in books and talks, but nothing seems to work, although I often simply fall asleep. How do I stop what people call monkey brain and stay conscious?
Okay, so sometimes it's partly a function of your age. Now, if you're very young, then tiring your body through some physical exercise is a really good way. My younger daughter, she has a very, very busy mind, and I saw her growing up, because I have two girls, they're very different. And although I did teach her some breathing exercises, the thing that really helped was when she picked up sports. So when the body, is tired or exercised and become rested, then the mind gets relaxed. So that's one thing if you're young, very young. Now, if you are not that young and then the mind is still busy, for a lot of people it is. So, but the fact that you are able to recognize that it is playing monkey is a good thing. Many people don't even recognize that. Okay, so that's a really good thing. It's a progress. One thing that you could try is to, instead of trying formal sitting, just going for a walk in a really good, if you have access to good nature, and particularly if you can do some trekking on highlands with a vast vista in front of you, that really gives you a feeling of what it feels like to have a calm, expansive mind. So once you experience it, then you have a kind of a sense of what it feels like. So that, I think, those things, you need those kind of props. And one thing that could help is, in the Tibetan tradition, sometimes we use the imagery of space as a way of quieting our mind, because mind, a lot of our restlessness really comes from a sort of a movement of energy, kind of a mind being too busy. So, conjuring a kind of a feeling or image of a space-like openness, in your mind, can actually help, because it's a bit like, and this is where, getting the experience of having a big view from a top mountain, that's a really good one, with a vast valley in front of you, because you get a sense of what it feels like. So that is another type of practice. Or you can, one practice that I suggest to a lot of beginners is sort of listening to inner silence. So you do some breathing, and after you have done some kind of deep breathing, and when your body feels a bit more relaxed, and then try to consciously slow your thought. And if the imagery helps, you can imagine it as if a wheel is turning slower and slower and slower and slower. And while you are imagining this, just think of listening to a silence that is deep inside you. It's almost like sort of thinking about a fading sound of a gong, because when you listen to some of these sounds, at some point you're not quite sure whether there is actually a sound or whether it is mind's image, the image of the sound in your mind. And at some point it disappears. So that kind of listening to inner silence, and with a feeling of you're deliberately trying to slow down, that could actually help. You can try those things. See, it also depends on, some people find this more expansive imagery more helpful. Some people kind of find this kind of, listening to deep silence inside and slowing down kind of helpful. And if nothing works, then counting the breath is a really good way of getting there, because you're at least giving your mind something to do. And it's not an external distraction. So you can start counting up to 10, then count again, and then see if you can count up to 20, 30. And if you can count up to 100 without distraction, then you are getting somewhere.
Well, those are great ideas. Thank you so much. And I also appreciate the fact that you bring in the imagery, and then what the imagery evokes and the felt sense of that, and then gaining access to meditative states through that.
Yes.
And I think that that's something particular probably to the Tibetan lineage. And it feels creative to me. We have different teachers from different lineages come, and I'm wondering if there's anything else you can say on that is unique about the Tibetan offering into the space of mindfulness, because it feels like you're using intention and talking about being proactive and ethical, and then using imagery. These things feel all very engaged in life.
Yes. One other technique that is used in the Tibetan tradition, and that's at the moment not that widely used in the secular context, except in the Tonglen practice, where they use imagery of kind of, smokes and lights. The the important technique that is used often is the imagery of light rays and nectars. And then, so for example, if you're feeling kind of lethargic, then having an imagery of a brighter light and, nectars getting into your body and feeling energized, and those are helpful. But if you're feeling kind of very distracted, then kind of having an imagery of, for example, you can imagine a vast open expanse of nature, and from the nature comes kind of lights that gets into your body and calms you down. So imagining sort of just slowing you down, those kind of, so light imagery is another thing that is used in the Tibetan tradition.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that as well. And we have one or two more questions here. So this is a question for you personally. Olaf wants to know, what is most important to you regarding your own understanding and practice in meditation? What's been most important to you, either that you've discovered or that you adhere to in your practice?
In my own personal practice, I'm a very devout Tibetan Buddhist. So, although I developed a secular compassion training, my own personal practice is really quite Buddhist on a day-to-day basis. But one thing that I really find most, helpful is really the intention setting practice. I really find that so powerful. I do it on a daily basis, but also I do it when I have, important meeting that I have to lead. I check with my intention, and I really kind of consciously make a set of intentions to how to conduct myself in that meeting. Because what matters at the end from that particular meeting, because sometimes our egos get wrapped up, and then we create more problem than solve the problem. So in those kind of situations, I really find the intention setting that is part of the Tibetan tradition really, really very, very helpful. And then also in my practice, of course, alongside compassion, meditation on emptiness is a very important part of it. That is a powerful antidote against getting too caught up in your head, and especially when you become a bit more sort of successful, or things should not go to your head, and humility, and also less attachment. So for these kind of things, the teachings on emptiness are really, really powerful. And I to this day, although I speak English quite fluently, but one area where the English has never spoken to me powerfully is the area of poetry. And I read mainly, when it comes to poetry, I just read Tibetan poetry. And many of the poems that I read are experiential songs written by great meditators and masters who articulate their experience through imageries, and also, particularly things to do with impermanence, very simple facts of reality, impermanence, loss, letting go, emptiness, the complexity of reality. So I find these, so what I do is every now and then I'll choose a particular poet, few verses, and when I do my morning meditation at the end, I read those verses, and many of these verses I actually know by heart. So those kind of things. So I try to, I find these more aesthetic approaches also very powerfully enhancing in my own spiritual life. There is a beautiful poem by a 17th century Tibetan master who says that for someone who is able to view everything as metaphors, for such a yogi, there is no shortage of Dharma teaching. So in other words, you can pretty much take everything that happens in your life as a kind of a lesson in your life. So those are the things that I really find very meaningful. And also, they are not detached from my everyday life. I am a father of 2 girls, and I have, my wife, a relationship, and, I work. And so, as much as possible, I try to make sure that there is no real dichotomy between my state of mind when I'm sitting down and when I'm in the world, And then when you can do that, then it's more meaningful.
Well, that's so touching. And I would like to say on behalf of everyone that I'd love to see some translations of those poems that you're reading into Tibetan. So that might be your next manuscript. If I could have an ask for that. Well, we just have one last question before I'll ask if you can do a closing for us. And it's a question from one person, but I feel it's a question for all of us who are listening here. It's a woman named Shinchak, and her question is, being a modern Buddhist nun in the USA, what is the best way to help all sentient beings?
Wow, that's a very, very challenging question. I think one thing that I feel is that a Buddhist nun, one area where Buddhist teachers, and particularly the nun teachers, can really make a big difference, is really bringing the message of compassion and its mental cultivation in a secular way, not in the Buddhist way, in larger public setting. So, in fact, in my compassion training group, 2 of the certified instructors are, Tibetan Buddhist nuns. And they, when I spoke with them, and I said, first it's looked a little weird. I said, why do you need to do this? How to practice compassion and do meditation. And they said, both of them said that they're there because what they find in secular meditation on compassion is a kind of a more universal language that resonates with a variety of different people. Mm-hmm. And some, I know that some Buddhist nuns also serve as chaplains in different universities or in prison or different settings. So being a Buddhist nun need not mean that always you should be teaching the Dharma, you should be teaching Buddhism. You can also teach insights and spiritual practices from the Buddhist tradition in a more universal secular way, so that because in the end the Buddha himself said, according to the Pali sources, that he said, I've taught only one thing only, suffering and its elevation. That's really what the Buddha said. He said everything that he has taught is for the sake of elevation of suffering. And if we take that seriously, then there is nothing wrong for a Buddhist to be teaching in a secular way so that you can reach more sentient beings and serve them. And in the end, serving other people to make themselves more active agent in bringing about greater happiness in their own life is the best way. It's like, instead of feeding, teaching, giving seeds to someone to plant something so that they can support themselves. And in the Buddhist tradition also, we speak of different forms of giving. And one form of giving is giving spiritual counseling and freedom from fear. So those are powerful forms of giving that, Buddhist nuns can do, outside the Buddhist community in a larger, secular setting.
Well, I'm just so moved by your sharing and by this advice. It's deeply touching to hear the way that you're responding to these questions. So I want to thank you for all of us, and would also enjoy if you'd like to provide us with a closing of any kind before I speak to the larger audience here.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. And thank you really for inviting me to be part of this wonderful community. And it's been a real pleasure as well as honor. And, I feel inspired and moved when I see a community of individuals from different parts of the world coming together, motivated by wanting to improve themselves, train their minds so that they can not only be better individuals in their own life, but also be more effective in serving the world. So that's a compassionate ideal. That's a bodhisattva ideal from the Buddhist point of view. So it's been a real pleasure and honor to be able to make some contribution. So I wanted to share that. So before we conclude, what I thought we could do is to once again invite everybody to really connect with that intention that is in all of us, to wanting to make a difference, wanting to be a better person, wanting to start bringing out that change as a result of working on ourselves. First from our, like a ripples spreading outwards, first from ourselves to our immediate circle of our family members and friends, then the ripple effects going out. And then let's, as much as possible, as a result of being part of this monthly mindfulness monthly community, try to pay conscious attention to the place of compassion in our everyday life. And of course, every now and then we will fail, but let's not beat ourselves, but congratulate ourselves for the fact that we are trying. So, and the more we are able to bring conscious attention to compassion in our everyday life, we will then be able to make a difference in a wise way, both in making ourselves better and also bringing some benefit and difference in other people's life as well. And one thing that I would like to request to all of you, those who take the idea of compassion seriously, to as much as possible make sure that we don't live our life just for ourselves and our immediate family. Let's try to live our life for more people, for a larger cause. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Thubten Jinpa, for being with us tonight. We've definitely appreciated it, and for joining our mindfulness monthly community throughout this past month. We really enjoyed having you as part of our community. And this concludes our live Q&A session for Mindfulness Monthly. We have a few notes for our community. I'm excited to announce our featured teacher for the month of July is Mirabai Bush. July will be dedicated to mindfulness in the workplace. You'll be receiving Mirabai's video teaching and first guided meditation the first Thursday in July. So that's Thursday, July 5th. And we encourage you now to head on over to your Mindfulness Monthly Facebook community page to connect with others about what your biggest takeaways were this month with Jinpa and his teachings on conscious intention. Also, our Facebook group is a great place to ask questions to the community if you're struggling with any teachings as well. We're all here for one another. For Sounds True, this is Kelly Boys. Thanks for being with us. SoundsTrue.com, waking up the world.